Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. It's time for a gaming monitor roundup. Today I'm looking at the current 27-inch 4K mini LED options to see which one makes the most sense to buy. These are great choices for people that want a high-resolution gaming experience, proper local dimming for immersive HDR, and an LCD panel for productivity tasks with no risk of burn-in. The latest models released in 2025 have been some of the best ones yet, and we'll be going through everything you need to know in today's video. This roundup is focusing on the latest panel technology in this category because I think this panel is clearly the best of those that I've tested. The key specifications are a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD panel, a 1152 zone mini LED local dimming backlight, HDR brightness exceeding 1000 nits, and dual mode functionality with a 1080p 320Hz configuration. But before we get into all the testing,
today's video is brought to you by UGREEN and their Nexode 65-watt travel charger. As part of the Nexode Pro series, this is an ultra-slim fast charger delivering exceptional 65-watt charging in a credit card-sized form factor. This is the ideal travel companion as it comes equipped with interchangeable US, UK, EU and AU plugs right out of the box, making this the only wall charger you'd need to take abroad. This little unit packs a punch with 65 watts of efficient, super fast charging at the 2.0 spec, allowing for a 50% MacBook Air M2 recharge in 30 minutes. Equipped with a pair of USB Type-C and a single USB Type-A port, you can plug in 3 devices simultaneously with the intelligent GaN Infinity chip handling the rest, ensuring fast, safe, and cooler charging. If you happen to be jet-setting over the New Year period, we would highly suggest considering one of these, so for more information, please check the links in the video description.
So let's take a look at the options I've tested for this roundup. First up is the MSI MPG274 URDFW E16M, seen here with the white design, though it's also available as a very similar monitor with a black design called the MAG274 UPDF E16M. This displays an MSRP of $500 US, though it can be purchased on sale for as low as $430 US based on what I've seen throughout 2025. The KTC M27P6 also uses a predominantly white design, though it has a lower MSRP of $470 US. Currently, KTC are offering a discount via their official store that brings it down to $410. Like with a lot of these monitors, you do have to pay close attention to the name. KTC also sell the M27T6, which is 1440p instead of 4K, and uses an entirely different panel. The AOC U27G4XM isn't as widely available yet, but uses the same panel as all the others. In Australia, this model is on store shelves already, and it's about 20% cheaper than the MSI E16M, so this would imply a US MSRP of about $400 US, and I've been told it will be available in the US at some point. Lastly, we're also checking out the Koorui S2741LM, which we haven't looked at on the channel before. Same panel as the other options, with a typical price tag of $500 US and an all-time low of $460 US. As you can see, there's a lot of price competition between these options, so let's see how they perform. I'm going to dive straight into motion performance to start with, and the key thing to note here is that all 4 of these monitors run at up to 160Hz in their 4K mode with adaptive sync variable refresh rate support. From a refresh rate standpoint and smoothness, there is no difference between these products. Response time performance dictates the level of clarity, blur, ghosting, and artifacts seen during motion at the same refresh rate. If we compare all these monitors at their maximum 160Hz refresh rate and also slot in a few other relevant options into the chart, we see a couple of things. The MSI and AOC variants offer about the same speed, right around 5 milliseconds with an inverse ghosting rate between 15 and 20%. The KTC and Koorui monitors are a little slower in response times, sitting around 6.5 to 7 milliseconds, but with a near zero inverse ghosting rate. Inverse ghosting is an artifact where brighter trails are seen behind darker moving objects, so essentially the MSI and AOC models are a little faster, but more prone to inverse ghosting, whereas the KTC and Koorui monitors drop down the speed a bit to avoid this. Cumulative deviation is a measure of how close the monitor gets to ideal instant response times and factors in all aspects to how the display transitions, including speed and overshoot. At 160Hz, all of these options offer a pretty similar overall experience. The AOC model is the best tuned for the highest refresh rate, but the MSI isn't too far behind, while the KTC and Koorui options are practically identical. Even though the KTC and Koorui models are behind the AOC, there's only a 12% difference in result, which is very hard to spot in practice. So if you're planning on using your monitor right up near the max refresh at 4K, there isn't a huge difference between these models. Now if we look on average across the refresh rate range from 160Hz to 60Hz, things change a bit. The MSI model is the fastest at 4.8 milliseconds, but is very prone to inverse ghosting at middle to lower refresh rates, and the overdrive choices to improve performance are limited. On the other end of the scale, the AOC is the slowest on average, but does so using an overdrive mode that produces few overshoot artifacts. Typically, the AOC model is tuned towards the higher end of the refresh rate range and doesn't perform as well in the middle to lower parts. Sitting in the middle of this range are the KTC and Koorui models, with the KTC running a little faster, but the Koorui is pretty artifact-free at most refresh rates, so I think it offers the best experience. The speed it offers is pretty typical of a modern IPS LCD as well, so this 27-inch 4K panel is keeping up with the times. Average cumulative deviation is also favorable to the Koorui model, which by a fraction has the best tuning and the best single overdrive mode experience using the fast overdrive settings. There's not a lot in it though. The Koorui is just 5% ahead of the AOC and 8% ahead of the KTC, so all three of these models are excellent. I'd give the win to the Koorui for the most balanced response time performance for variable refresh gamers in the 4K mode, and the AOC the win at the higher end of the range. The MSI model isn't bad, but it's just not as well optimized as the other products, and you can see this in the cumulative deviation chart. Couple of additional charts here is 120Hz performance. I quite like the KTC and Koorui models here. The AOC is a little slower and the MSI suffers from inverse ghosting. At 60Hz, the best choice is the Koorui model, though the AOC isn't too different. All four of these monitors support dual mode functionality, which allows the panel to be switched over into a 1080p 320Hz configuration. It's a seamless process on all models that retains full feature compatibility, so you can still use HDR and adaptive sync with the same color experience in the 1080p mode. The only difference is the lower resolution, which is not ideal for desktop apps due to worse text clarity, but is still perfectly fine for the intended use case, which is fast-paced multiplayer games that benefit from the higher 320Hz refresh rate. Accessing dual mode is easiest on the Koorui model, which has a dedicated button along the bottom edge. The MSI and AOC models use a shortcut on the directional OSD toggle, while the KTC buries the option inside the OSD settings menu, so on that model switching into the 1080p 320Hz mode takes the most effort. On all four models, the optimal overdrive setting is different at 1080p to at 4K, but whatever overdrive setting you choose is applied across both modes, which is quite frustrating. The MSI and KTC models are the best tuned for 1080p performance at 320Hz, whereas the AOC and Koorui don't really have a suitable setting for dual mode, so produce too much overshoot when run at the required response time speeds. In all cases, the 320Hz mode is clearer than 4K 160Hz, so there are benefits for multiplayer gamers, but if dual mode was one of the main reasons you were buying one of these monitors, I'd stick to the KTC or MSI options. Also relevant for fast-paced gaming is input lag, and you'll be glad to know there is no tangible difference between SDR input lag across these models. All offer below 1 millisecond of processing delay. In the HDR mode with local dimming enabled, input lag is higher due to processing related to the backlight zones, but the differences between the models are again pretty negligible, with a processing delay around 10 milliseconds. For port selection, all four models come with one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.1 48GB per second ports as standard, and all offer 10-bit 4K 160Hz functionality on these ports. The MSI and Koorui models also allow you to disable DSC. Three of the models include USB-C and a KVM switch, the exception being the AOC model, which offers neither. However, all models have at least a 2-port USB hub. From this standpoint, the AOC model is clearly the least capable, and while all four offer the basic options that a PC gamer would need with no clear drawbacks, if you want the best port selection, that is the MSI model, with the KTC and Koorui not too far behind. Now let's look at SDR Color Performance. All four models offer the same Rec 2020 color gamut coverage, as all use the same IPS panel with a quantum dot enhancement layer. This results in Rec 2020 coverage between 81 and 84%, with 99% coverage of DCI-P3. These are all very wide gamut displays, which is fantastic for HDR content, but also highly useful for work that requires a wider gamut. SDR brightness is one area where each brand is able to differentiate themselves. The KTC model is clearly the brightest, unlocking 725 nits, which is super bright, and the Koorui isn't too far behind at 658 nits. The AOC hits 558 nits, also a great result that makes the monitor highly usable, while the MSI is the weakest at just 446 nits, which is more of a typical number. Minimum brightness for these models is all within the good range. The native contrast ratio of this panel without local dimming enabled, and we recommend leaving dimming disabled for SDR use, is around 1100 to 1. The highest result I saw was the Koorui at 1163 to 1, the lowest the MSI at 1063 to 1. But I expect a bit of panel variances at play here, and all four models should offer about the same native contrast. In terms of color accuracy, straight out of the box, the best model is the MSI E16M, which has the most accurate color temperature and best gamma performance, which leads to the lowest and therefore best delta E average in this chart. The KTC and Koorui options are similar, but not as good, operating by default with a colder color temperature, though still good gamma. The AOC model is clearly the worst, and this is due to incorrect out-of-the-box gamma. The four models operate with an unclamped color gamut out of the box, leading to oversaturation. If we now compare the sRGB modes available with each model, performance does improve generally. In grayscale, the MSI, Koorui, and AOC models are all pretty similar, with the KTC model being notably behind, and not really meeting our standards for factory calibration. When we flick over to color checker, the best model is the AOC, followed by the Koorui, then the MSI, and lastly the KTC model again. All have quite effective sRGB gamut emulation, so there's no wonkiness there. The rest comes down to things like saturation and color temperature accuracy. In addition to this, each model has some flexibility around what settings are enabled and disabled in the OSD when the sRGB mode is used. While the KTC model has the weakest accuracy in this mode, it allows you to adjust white balance, whereas the other models do not. Assessing color accuracy more generally across these results, the most balanced choice is probably the Koorui, as it performs quite well in the sRGB mode and isn't too bad using factory settings. It has a reasonable range of color controls as well. But realistically, you can calibrate all of these displays to a similar level using ICC profiles, as they use the same panel, and none are way off the mark from the factory. When it comes to HDR performance, all four models are equipped with a 1152 zone mini LED backlight, which significantly increases the level of contrast the panel is capable of when local dimming is enabled. However, just because the panel hardware is the same on all models doesn't mean the way it's tuned is the same. Each OEM can decide how to modify the backlight behavior, which leads to some differences across the models. Generally, there are two primary methods of controlling a backlight. Each backlight zone has to deal with thousands of pixels, so a decision must be made as to what level the backlight runs at to show these pixels accurately. One method is to ensure the brightest pixels are accurate, and to do that the backlight zone runs at a high output level. I like to call this highlight bias dimming. The other method is to ensure the darkest pixels are accurate, which runs the zone at a low output level. I like to call this shadow bias dimming. LCD manufacturers can choose the degree to which either method is used and in what circumstances, so you can think of it like a spectrum. The MSI and AOC models favour a shadow bias dimming approach. If there are tricky scenes with bright and dark elements close together, these monitors tend to favour black levels and contrast, so run the backlight zones a bit lower to prevent blooming. This comes at the expense of peak brightness, as in some situations small bright elements won't reach their intended brightness level. The KTC and Koorui models sit in the middle between shadow biased and highlight bias dimming. This means peak brightness is high in tricky scenes with small bright elements, particularly on the KTC, but it comes at the expense of more blooming compared to the MSI and AOC models. The level of blooming is still manageable and not overly noticeable. It's not like you see raised blacks all the time, but overall the panel isn't as contrast focused as the others. I don't have a strong preference towards either dimming method because there are strengths and weaknesses in different types of content. Sometimes the additional punch on the KTC and Koorui is nice, but then in a scene with subtitles, I'm less enthusiastic about how it handles blooming. The good news is that all four models use fast local dimming at 4K 160Hz, which is well suited to gaming. You won't see slow backlight transitions or the backlight ramping up and down. These are pretty instant panels in that sense. The Koorui and KTC are slightly more prone to backlight zone flicker in fast-paced gaming than the MSI and AOC, as they are more highlight biased, but this isn't a major issue. The AOC model though for some reason runs the backlight a lot slower at a fixed 60Hz, so that's something to keep in mind. If I had to pick one of these displays based on how the backlight is tuned, I'd pick the MSI variant because in addition to running great out of the box, it also offers a setting called halo dimming that isn't available on the other models. With this setting, you can adjust the degree to which highlight bias dimming is used. If you turn the setting down from the default maximum setting, you get increased highlight brightness with increased haloing. So on the MSI model, you can optimize the experience to how you personally want to run the monitor, whereas on the others, you have to accept how the panel is tuned from the factory. When it comes to HDR accuracy, most models run quite well using their default settings, so little needs changing in the OSD. The AOC model, I'd recommend changing to the display HDR mode with strong local dimming. EOTF tracking accuracy in grayscale trades blows between models, but most are generally in the good range. The MSI and Koorui models, for example, are the best tuned for dark scenes, but are weaker in bright scenes, and you see the reverse for the AOC model. The KTC model is probably the weakest here, though it performs quite well in color match. None of these variants have problematic HDR calibration. In HDR brightness, the KTC model has the best sustained full screen brightness, achieving an astonishing 1656 nits. With a 10% window, the Koorui and KTC models are quite similar, with the MSI and AOC further behind. With a 2% window, we see the KTC achieving over 1100 nits, the Koorui at 930 nits, the AOC at 830 nits, and the MSI at 805 nits. This shows that in terms of highlight bias dimming, the KTC is more aggressive with brightness than the Koorui. In real scene results, this ranking also tends to hold true. The KTC model is the brightest in most scenes, achieving an average of 1000 nits across the 8 scenes we test. The Koorui isn't far behind with an average of 937 nits, but better accuracy than the KTC. The MSI is less than 10% off the Koorui and 15% dimmer than the KTC on average, but with all three achieving over 850 nits on average, I wouldn't describe this as a hugely noticeable difference. The AOC model is a bit more balanced in its accuracy, but it suffers a bit in brightness, though to be clear, as an LCD it's still very bright overall. The big thing I noticed is that the AOC model can't push much beyond 1200 nits even in synthetic tests, whereas the MSI tops out at around 1600 nits and the other two models at nearly 2000 nits. However, things flip a bit when assessing contrast. The AOC model has the best local contrast, also putting up strong results in close contrast where a bright and dark object are right next to each other. This is where we start to see the KTC deviate a bit from the others. In checkerboard contrast, I found the AOC to be the best, the MSI slightly behind, then a larger gap to the KTC and Koorui models, indicative of less shadow bias dimming. All models offer a similar level of color volume, with the brighter units performing a little better. Lastly, I just want to make a brief mention of the additional features and design that you get with each model. All four support backlight strobing to increase motion clarity, and here the model I'd avoid is the AOC, given it produces worse results than the others. This isn't really a feature I'd strongly recommend using though, so it's easy to ignore otherwise. The design is pretty subjective across all the models, it depends on what you like the look of the most. MSI and KTC both offer white models, the MSI also basically comes in a black version, while the KTC and AOC are predominantly black. All use the same sort of matte screen coating, no major differences in the actual panel implementation and bezel size. If you like RGB LED lighting, then the MSI and Koorui models have the best implementation of that, the Koorui with a circular LED module around the stand connection, and the MSI via their cool patterned element on the rear. The AOC model does not have RGB lighting at all, while the KTC only has an RGB LED logo. The stand is pretty similar on all variants, offering height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustability. The MSI and KTC models have flatter bases, which comes in handy for putting items on top of it when sitting on your desk. The Koorui base is relatively flat as well, while the AOC stand uses V-shaped prongs like a lot of other monitors. I think the build quality of the MSI model is the best overall by quite a margin. It's a great looking monitor, nice premium construction, and it has a metal stand base. A lot of the exterior is plastic like the other options, but it's the nicest combination of plastic finishes and shapes. The Koorui is more basic in terms of surface finish, but is still pretty good as well. I like the simple exterior on the rear. The AOC model is in a similar boat with its simpler design and okay build quality. The KTC model though is pretty average in its build quality. It looks nice, but the build is a bit rough around the edges. At the end of the day, the good news is that of these four 27-inch 4K mini LED monitors, none are garbage products that should be avoided. When we looked at mini LED LCDs in previous years, it was pretty common to find one or two absolute stinker products with serious flaws, but in 2025 with the latest 1152 zone dual mode capable panels, they're all pretty good. There's no clear best choice either. I think most buyers would be happy with any one of them. However, while they're all good products in their own right, they're also not identical, so picking the right choice for you will come down to the things you value the most in a monitor, as well as pricing and availability. So I'll quickly break down which options are the best for the main performance categories. If motion performance is the key factor for you, there aren't huge differences between each model, but I think overall the KTC variant is the best optimized. I say that because it delivers a great experience for 4K variable refresh gaming, it's decent at the highest refresh rates, you can get the 1080p 320Hz mode working well without overshoot, and backlight strobing is acceptable. The Koorui model would be a close second, followed by the AOC model, whereas response times are weakest on the MSI variant. When it comes to HDR image quality, all use the same 1152 zone backlight, and performance is typically a battle between brighter tuning with more blooming and higher contrast tuning with lower brightness. I'd have the MSI model as the best here because it's great out of the box and offers user customizable zone tuning, while delivering overall HDR brightness in the middle of the 4 options. The KTC is the brightest if that is the most important to you. Across many other categories, it's hard to separate these monitors. The KTC and Koorui offer the highest SDR brightness, but all 4 models offer more than enough for typical use cases. The Koorui offers a nice balance of calibration in several different conditions, but the other options have their strengths too, and you can calibrate all of these displays to a similar level. Color gamut and native contrast are basically identical across the board. With such a close battle, factors like design and features become more important. The MSI 274 URDFW has the best build quality in my opinion and the best port selection, with the most feature-rich USB-C implementation and KVM switch support. The Koorui is pretty decent as well in these areas, while it's a notable weakness of the AOC as it lacks USB-C entirely. But then you might not be the sort of gamer that needs USB-C or a KVM switch, in which case those feature omissions are irrelevant. All 4 of these products do a great job with the basics. Ultimately, price is going to be a major factor here, though it's hard to make a definitive call given how often these products fluctuate between sale prices and the MSRP. Typically, most are around the $450 US mark, with minor variances either way. I think the AOC model probably needs to be the cheapest. It's the weakest of the 4 products with the fewest outstanding characteristics, and it certainly is the cheapest in Australia right now, so it stays in contention. When the KTC model is down near $410, I think that is a great choice given it performs well across most categories, and I'd like to see the Koorui in that ballpark as well, which is another monitor that offers a great balance. Sometimes the Koorui is as high as $600 US though, which puts it well out of the running. Definitely wait for it to hit below $500. And then lastly, there's the MSI model, which probably would be the best choice if MSI didn't fumble the response time tuning. It's not slow or anything, but it's the weakest in that category while being pretty strong elsewhere. If you're not overly sensitive to motion artifacts, I'd pick the MSI option at a price point below $500 US, but it's not a definitive recommendation. So anyway, that's it for this one. If you do want to support Monitors Unboxed and the independent testing that we do, we have Patreon. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to things like our monitor settings database and ICC profiles. We have our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors, and you'll just be supporting all of the independent testing and reviews that we do, which is always nice. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.